The vast ideological chasm between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War wasn't measured only in nuclear warheads and military posturing. It was also quantified in something as seemingly mundane as the glow emanating from American living rooms. While Americans gathered around vibrant color television sets watching The Wonderful World of Disney in dazzling Technicolor by the late 1960s, most Soviet citizens remained huddled around black and white sets, their cultural window to the world limited to the monochromatic state-approved programming of official channels. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world, and if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The contrast between American and Soviet television experiences wasn't merely technological. It represented fundamentally different approaches to consumer culture, information control, and the very definition of prosperity. When Soviet officials, journalists, and ordinary citizens visited the United States during the thaw periods of the Cold War, many experienced something akin to culture shock upon discovering that color television was not a luxury reserved for the elite or a propaganda fabrication, but a common fixture in millions of middle-class American homes. This revelation challenged the Soviet narrative about capitalist inequality and exploitation. How could a system they had been taught was fundamentally unjust provide its ordinary citizens with such technological marvels for everyday entertainment? The cognitive dissonance this created would become one of the less discussed but profoundly influential psychological aspects of the Cold War information battle. Moscow, 1959. Nikita Khrushchev had just returned from his famous American tour, where he had witnessed firsthand the material abundance of American society. During a closed-door presidium meeting at the Kremlin, the Soviet leader pounded the table in frustration. Their workers, their ordinary workers, have machines in their homes that our ministers cannot get, he reportedly exclaimed. Among the consumer goods that had most impressed him were the household appliances, particularly television sets displaying programs in vivid color. The development of color television technology had been pursued on both sides of the Iron Curtain since the late 1940s, but with dramatically different priorities and outcomes. In the United States, the National Television System Committee, NTSC, had established color broadcasting standards by 1953, and NBC began limited color broadcasts that same year. By contrast, the Soviet CCAM system wouldn't be fully implemented until the mid-1960s, and even then, color TV sets remained prohibitively expensive and scarce for the average Soviet citizen until well into the 1980s. This technological disparity wasn't simply a matter of engineering capability. Soviet factories could produce nuclear weapons, satellites, and sophisticated military equipment, but the centralized command economy consistently failed to prioritize consumer goods. Instead, resources were directed toward heavy industry, defense, and prestigious projects that could demonstrate Soviet technological prowess on the world stage. Consumer satisfaction remained secondary, an afterthought in the 5-year plans that guided economic development. The American economic model, by contrast, had fused technological innovation with mass production and aggressive marketing, creating not just color television technology, but an entire color television culture. By 1965, NBC broadcast its entire primetime lineup in color. The following year, ABC and CBS followed suit. The networks understood that color content would drive color television sales, and manufacturers competed fiercely to bring increasingly affordable sets to market. This dynamic was almost entirely absent in the Soviet Union, where television manufacturing was determined by centralized planners rather than consumer demand. Leonid Brezhnev, who succeeded Khrushchev in 1964, recognized the propaganda value of demonstrating Soviet technological capabilities through television, but the gap between policy pronouncements and the lived reality of Soviet citizens remained vast. The psychological impact of this disparity came into sharp focus during cultural exchanges and international exhibitions, venues where ordinary Soviets could glimpse aspects of American life. One of the most significant of these was the 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow, where Vice President Richard Nixon and Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in their famous kitchen debate, an impromptu discussion about the merits of their respective systems while standing in a model American kitchen. Though color television wasn't central to that particular exchange, the exhibition did feature American television technology, providing many Soviets their first glimpse of color broadcasting. Yuri Andropov, who headed the KGB from 1967 to 1982, before briefly becoming General Secretary, understood the potential danger of such cultural infiltration. In a classified report to the Central Committee in 1968, he warned that Western technological products served as material propaganda for the capitalist way of life. Color television, with its vibrant portrayal of Western abundance, was particularly problematic because it made abstract ideological arguments about capitalism's failings seem less convincing to ordinary citizens who could see the apparent benefits with their own eyes. The Soviet information apparatus responded with a two-pronged approach, restricting information about Western consumer culture when possible, and when such restrictions were impractical, emphasizing that American material abundance came at the cost of spiritual emptiness, racial inequality, and exploitation of workers in other countries. Soviet newspapers like Pravda and Izvestia regularly published articles highlighting homelessness, crime, and economic uncertainty in America, attempting to counter the seductive image of consumer prosperity. Yet this narrative became increasingly difficult to maintain as cultural exchanges expanded in the 1970s during the period of détente. Soviet delegations to the United States, whether diplomatic, scientific, athletic, or cultural, invariably returned with stories about the widespread availability of color televisions and other consumer goods. Such accounts spread through informal networks, challenging the official portrayal of American life. Oleg Kalugin, a former KGB general who later became a critic of the Soviet system, recalled in his memoirs how Soviet intelligence officers stationed in the United States would sometimes become disillusioned with their own system after experiencing American consumer culture. The problem wasn't that we didn't know about American prosperity. We did, Kalugin wrote. The problem was that we saw it firsthand and realized the gap was much wider than our propaganda admitted. Color televisions in nearly every home, supermarkets full of food, automobiles for ordinary families, these everyday realities contradicted what we had been telling our people. For Soviet officials permitted to travel to the United States, the ubiquity of color television represented just one aspect of a disconcerting pattern. Georgy Arbatov, who served as the director of the Institute for the USA and Canada, a Soviet think tank focused on North American studies, described in a confidential report to the Central Committee how American technological innovation in consumer goods created popular support for the capitalist system despite its contradictions. Americans accept social inequality, he wrote, in part because technological advances like color television and household appliances give even middle-income citizens a sense of progress and participation in modernity. Meanwhile, on American soil, the United States Information Agency, USIA, deliberately showcased American technological achievements to visiting Soviet citizens. When Soviet journalists, academics, or artists visited the United States on exchange programs, their American hosts made sure they saw not just cultural landmarks, but also ordinary suburban homes with their color televisions, washing machines, and multiple automobiles. A material abundance that stood in stark contrast to the Soviet emphasis on collective rather than individual consumption. The color television gap became particularly evident during coverage of major international events. The 1972 Munich Olympics were broadcast in color throughout the United States and Western Europe, while Soviet viewers largely watched the same events in black and white. Similarly, the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, a symbolic joint space mission during détente, was televised in color across America, but primarily in black and white within the USSR. Even this historic moment of cooperation revealed the technological disparity between the competing systems. By the mid-1970s, Soviet authorities recognized that their technological lag in consumer electronics was becoming a political liability. The Ninth Five-Year Plan, 1971-1975, included provisions for expanding the production of color television sets, and factory retooling began in cities like Voronezh, Minsk, and Lvov. Production rose from negligible numbers in the late 1960s to about 100,000 units in 1973, but this remained far below demand and far behind American production figures, which by then numbered in the millions annually. Soviet television itself was undergoing changes during this period. In 1967, the USSR launched its second television channel, focused on cultural programming. By 1973, limited color broadcasting had begun in major cities, primarily featuring special events, ceremonial occasions, and selected entertainment programs. Yet the infrastructure for widespread color broadcasting remained underdeveloped, and the majority of Soviet programming continued in black and white well into the late 1970s. For ordinary Soviet citizens, a color television set represented not just entertainment, but status. The waiting lists for these coveted items could stretch for years. Boris Yeltsin, who would later become the first president of post-Soviet Russia, recalled in his autobiography how, as a Communist Party official in Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, in the 1970s, he was able to bypass the waiting list, a privilege of his position that he recognized was unavailable to most citizens. The gap between promise and reality created cynicism among the Soviet population. A joke from the period captured this sentiment. Radio Yerevan was asked, "When will the average Soviet family be able to purchase a color TV?" Radio Yerevan answered, "The average American family can already purchase a color TV." Such political humor reflected an awareness of the disparity that official pronouncements tried to minimize. The Soviet leadership was not oblivious to the political implications of this consumer gap. Alexei Kosygin, who served as premier from 1964 to 1980, repeatedly advocated for reforms that would make the Soviet economy more responsive to consumer demand. "We cannot expect people to be satisfied with ideological slogans alone," he reportedly told his colleagues in the Politburo. "Material well-being, including modern conveniences, is not contradictory to socialist principles." However, Kosygin's economic reform proposals were consistently watered down by more conservative elements within the Soviet leadership, who feared that consumer-oriented policies might weaken central planning and ideological control. The military-industrial complex continued to command the lion's share of resources and technological talent, leaving consumer electronics development as a secondary priority, despite its growing political significance. For Americans, particularly during the economic challenges of the 1970s, with its oil crisis and inflation, color television ownership became a reassuring symbol that the American way of life continued to deliver technological benefits even in difficult times. Market saturation grew from about 40% of American households in 1970 to nearly 85% by 1980. Television manufacturers continuously improved their products, introducing features like remote controls, larger screens, and better color reproduction, while competition kept driving prices down. The contrast with Soviet consumer electronics was stark. While American consumers could choose among dozens of television models from companies like RCA, Zenith, General Electric, and an increasing number of Japanese manufacturers like Sony and Panasonic, Soviet consumers faced limited choices, poor quality control, and persistent shortages. The few Soviet brands, Rubin, Electronica, Record, became synonymous with unreliability, frequent repairs, and outdated technology. Valentin Phelan, who served as Soviet ambassador to West Germany in the 1970s, before becoming chairman of the International Department of the Central Committee, observed in his internal communications that Western television ownership rates had become a de facto measure of standard of living, a metric by which the Soviet Union consistently lagged. We must recognize, he wrote in a classified analysis in 1977, that many of our citizens now judge our system's success not by our achievements in heavy industry or even space exploration, but by our ability to provide the goods they see in Western homes. The Soviet information apparatus responded by emphasizing different values and priorities. Soviet propaganda highlighted free education, health care, and full employment as advantages of their system, suggesting that American material abundance masked deeper social problems. Yet such arguments grew less persuasive as information about Western living standards filtered through increasingly permeable barriers. The 1970s saw the expansion of television itself as a medium of cultural exchange, albeit carefully controlled. The Soviet Union began purchasing select Western entertainment programs that were deemed ideologically safe, such as wildlife documentaries, classical music performances, and certain children's shows. These were typically shown without acknowledging their foreign origin or were edited to remove elements that might promote Western consumer culture. Concurrently, American television began featuring more content about the Soviet Union during the détente era. Programs like Meet the Soviets, ABC 1973, and various news specials attempted to give Americans glimpses of everyday life behind the Iron Curtain. These generally portrayed Soviet citizens as dignified but materially deprived compared to their American counterparts, reinforcing the narrative of American prosperity versus Soviet sacrifice. When Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev visited the United States in 1973, American television provided extensive color coverage of the diplomatic meetings, state dinners, and ceremonial events. This coverage was rebroadcast in the Soviet Union, but primarily in black and white, an ironic technological disparity that wasn't lost on more observant Soviet viewers who knew that Americans were watching the very same events in full color. By the late 1970s, the color television gap had become emblematic of broader disparities in consumer technology and standards of living. A classified CIA assessment from 1978 concluded the failure of the Soviet consumer economy to provide goods that have become standard in Western households, color televisions, reliable automobiles, modern appliances, creates a persistent source of dissatisfaction that Soviet authorities have been unable to resolve through ideological arguments. The color television disparity took on additional significance during the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The Soviet Union had invested heavily in presenting these games as a showcase of socialist achievements, including upgrading broadcasting facilities to provide color transmission to international audiences. Yet while global viewers watched the Moscow Olympics in color, many Soviet citizens still viewed the events on black and white sets because color televisions remained scarce and expensive. This irony, that the USSR could produce world-class color broadcasts for export while failing to deliver the same experience to its own citizens, encapsulated the contradictions within the Soviet system. For Soviet officials who traveled abroad, the commercial abundance of the West created cognitive dissonance. Alexander Yakovlev, who would later become one of Mikhail Gorbachev's key advisors on glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, spent 10 years as Soviet ambassador to Canada in the 1970s. During this time, he witnessed firsthand how market economies consistently outperformed centrally planned ones in providing consumer goods. He later recalled how this experience contributed to his growing recognition that the Soviet system required fundamental reform. The situation was particularly acute for Soviet diplomats, journalists, and trade representatives stationed in the United States, who lived in a sort of liminal space between Soviet restrictions and American abundance. Vladimir Posner, who later became a prominent television journalist, described in his autobiography how his time working in New York for Soviet media organizations in the 1970s forced him to reconcile contradictory realities. The America I saw with my own eyes was not the America described in our newspapers, he wrote. The gap was simply too wide to ignore. As the 1970s progressed, the influence of television itself was growing on both sides of the Iron Curtain, making the technological disparity even more significant. In the United States, color television had become the primary medium for news, entertainment, and advertising, a central fixture in American cultural life. The development of cable television expanded options further, with services like HBO beginning in the early 1970s and CNN launching in 1980, creating an ever more vibrant and diverse media landscape. In contrast, Soviet television remained limited to a few state-controlled channels with programming that many viewers found ideologically saturated and entertainment-poor. Satirist Mikhail Zhovanetsky captured this sentiment in a famous routine where he joked, "Television has made it impossible to be uninformed, but not impossible to be unentertainment." The quality gap in both technology and content created growing discontent, particularly among younger Soviets who had never experienced the hardships of World War II or Stalinism and were less willing to accept material sacrifices for ideological goals. By the early 1980s, as Cold War tensions reignited under the Reagan administration, American abundance, represented in part by widespread color television ownership, became an explicit element of U.S. strategy. Reagan frequently contrasted American prosperity with Soviet scarcity, arguing that this difference demonstrated the fundamental superiority of free market capitalism over centralized economic planning. For Soviet leaders, the challenge was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The technological gap was widening rather than narrowing, despite repeated promises in five-year plans. While American consumers were beginning to purchase videocassette recorders, personal computers, and increasingly sophisticated television sets, Soviet electronics remained generations behind. The waiting period for a color television in Moscow could still extend to several years, and in provincial cities, they remained almost unobtainable for ordinary citizens. The few Soviet elites who owned color television sets often acquired them through special channels, diplomatic connections, black market transactions, or the special stores that served the nomenklatura, the privileged bureaucratic class. This reality contradicted the egalitarian principles officially espoused by the Soviet system, creating resentment among the general population who saw evidence of a two-tiered society despite propaganda about socialist equality. In a last-ditch effort to close the consumer technology gap, Soviet leaders under Yuri Andropov, 1982-1984, and Konstantin Chernenko, 1984-1985, authorized increased imports of consumer electronics from Eastern European satellite states like East Germany and Hungary, which had developed somewhat more advanced manufacturing capabilities. However, these products remained inferior to Western alternatives and insufficient to meet demand. The consequences of this persistent gap would become fully apparent only in the late 1980s, when Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika lifted many restrictions on information flow and acknowledged many of the Soviet system's shortcomings. By then, the color television disparity had become just one facet of a comprehensive technological lag that extended across computing, telecommunications, and consumer electronics, areas increasingly recognized as vital to economic competitiveness in the modern world. As the Cold War entered its final years, a new generation of Soviet leaders began to recognize that they had lost not just the color television race, but a much broader competition for technological innovation and consumer satisfaction. The psychological impact of this realization would contribute significantly to the willingness to undertake radical reforms. reforms that would ultimately lead to the dissolution of the Soviet system itself. What happens when deeply held ideological beliefs collide with the visible evidence of technological disparity? How do ordinary citizens reconcile official narratives with their own observations? And how do leaders respond when the gap between promise and reality becomes too wide to ignore? As Soviet journalists, diplomats, and officials return from America with stories of color televisions in ordinary homes, these questions became increasingly difficult to avoid. The first significant exposure many ordinary Soviet citizens had to American color television came through cultural exchanges and exhibitions that intensified during the period of détente in the 1970s. The American Cultural Exhibition that toured Moscow, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and Kiev in 1974-1975 included a Television in America pavilion featuring the latest color sets and broadcasting technology. According to declassified State Department reports, this exhibit consistently drew the largest crowds, with Soviet visitors often spending hours watching the color programming and examining the television equipment. Mikhail Suslov, the Soviet Union's chief ideologist from the 1960s until his death in 1982, recognized the potential danger of such exposures. In a confidential memo to regional party secretaries in 1975, he warned, "American exhibitions deliberately emphasize consumer technologies that are designed to create dissatisfaction among our citizens. We must prepare our propaganda workers to explain that these displays represent exceptional rather than typical American households." Yet visitor surveys conducted secretly by American exhibition staff indicated that most Soviet attendees simply didn't believe these official explanations. Viktor Sukhodrev, who served as the primary interpreter for Soviet leaders from Khrushchev to Gorbachev, provided a unique perspective on this technological disparity. In his memoir, he recalled accompanying Alexei Kosygin on a 1971 visit to the RCA television manufacturing plant in Indiana. Kosygin was visibly impressed by the automated assembly lines producing thousands of color sets daily. Sukhodrev wrote, "On the flight back to Moscow, he confided to me that he doubted Soviet industry could match this scale of production within the decade, even with significant investment." This assessment proved accurate. Despite repeated efforts to ramp up domestic production of color televisions throughout the 1970s, Soviet manufacturing continued to lag. The Rubin factory in Moscow, the USSR's flagship television producer, struggled with quality control issues, component shortages, and outdated manufacturing techniques. While American factories were increasingly automated, Soviet television production remained labor-intensive and inefficient. The quality gap was equally significant. Soviet color televisions of the 1970s suffered from poor color reproduction, frequent breakdowns, and limited durability. A joke from the period captured this reality. "What's the most common repair for a Soviet color TV? Replacing the color." By contrast, American manufacturers had solved most technical problems by the late 1960s and were focusing on refinements, enhanced features, and cost reduction through mass production. For Soviet citizens, obtaining a color television often required extraordinary effort. Waiting lists at state stores could stretch for years. Those unwilling to wait might turn to the black market, where color sets imported from Eastern Europe or acquired through diplomatic channels might cost 3 to 4 times the official price, often representing more than a year's salary for an average worker. Stanislav, a Moscow engineer interviewed for this documentary, recalled, "My father was determined to get a color TV before the 1980 Olympics. He put our name on the waiting list in 1976, but by early 1980, we still hadn't received a call. Finally, he used a connection through a colleague whose brother worked in foreign trade to purchase a second-hand Grundig imported from East Germany. It cost 1,800 rubles when his monthly salary was about 280. The family economized on everything for nearly a year to afford it. The Soviet leadership was not ignorant of the growing disparity in consumer technology. Classified Politburo records from the mid-1970s reveal intense debates about resource allocation between military and consumer sectors. Defense hawks, led by figures like Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, argued that military preparedness remained paramount, while economic pragmatists like Premier Alexei Kosygin advocated for greater investment in consumer goods to maintain popular support for the system. These debates intensified as evidence mounted that the technology gap was affecting public morale. KGB reports from the period noted increasing expressions of discontent about the scarcity of modern consumer goods. One report from 1977 specifically mentioned color televisions, noting, "Citizens increasingly question why 30 years after the Great Patriotic War, World War II, basic modern appliances remain unavailable while they are standard in capitalist countries." The Soviet response to this challenge operated on multiple levels. At the economic level, production targets for consumer electronics were repeatedly raised in successive 5-year plans, though rarely achieved. At the ideological level, official propaganda emphasized different priorities and values, suggesting that socialist society offered more meaningful benefits than mere consumer goods. At the political level, special access to imported goods became an increasingly important privilege for the nomenklatura, creating an informal system of rewards for loyalty to the regime. Meanwhile, American television itself was evolving in ways that heightened the contrast. The 1970s saw color broadcasting expand beyond entertainment into news, sports, and educational programming. The visual impact of world events, from the Vietnam War to the moon landings, was dramatically enhanced by color transmission, creating a more immersive and emotionally engaging viewing experience for American audiences. This evolution did not go unnoticed by Soviet media analysts. A classified report prepared for the Central Committee's Department of Propaganda in 1976 observed, "American television news utilizes color technology to maximize emotional impact. Events like the bicentennial celebrations are presented with visual richness that our black and white broadcasting cannot match, creating a perception gap that affects how citizens evaluate national achievements." By the late 1970s, color television had become so ubiquitous in American society that black and white broadcasts seemed archaic to U.S. viewers. This was starkly illustrated during the 1976 presidential debates between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, broadcast in color to American homes but seen primarily in black and white by Soviet viewers when excerpts were shown on their news programs. The visual disparity subtly reinforced the narrative of America as technologically advanced and the Soviet Union as lagging behind. For Soviet citizens with access to both systems, the contrast was striking. Marina Goldovskaya, a Soviet documentary filmmaker who traveled to the United States on cultural exchanges in the 1970s, later recalled, "American television felt like it was from another planet, not just the color quality, but the production values, the pacing, the variety of programming. It made our broadcasts seem gray in every sense, not just visually." The psychological impact extended beyond entertainment value. Color television served as a window to a more vibrant world, making the limitations of Soviet life seem more restrictive by comparison. Vladimir Posner noted in his memoirs that Soviet citizens who had experienced Western television often developed a form of visual hunger upon returning home, finding Soviet programming visually impoverished, even when the content itself was intellectually stimulating. This hunger for visual stimulation fueled the growing market for smuggled Western television programs, which circulated on videocassettes among the Soviet elite by the late 1970s. Though VCRs remained extraordinarily rare in Soviet households, special screenings of Western shows and films became coveted invitations among the intelligentsia in Moscow and Leningrad, creating informal networks of cultural exchange that operated below the official radar. One unexpected consequence of the color television gap emerged in the field of Soviet cinema. With television technology lagging, Soviet film directors continued to receive relatively generous resources, maintaining a tradition of visual excellence even as Hollywood was increasingly influenced by television aesthetics. Directors like Andrei Tarkovsky, L.M. Klimov, and Sergei Bondarchuk created visually stunning films that compensated somewhat for the visual limitations of everyday Soviet media consumption. As the 1980s began, with superpower relations deteriorating following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the television technology gap became increasingly political. The Reagan administration, recognizing television's role in shaping public opinion, invested heavily in media strategies that showcased American prosperity in contrast to Soviet scarcity. Programs like Let Poland Be Poland, 1982, broadcast globally following the imposition of martial law in Poland, deliberately highlighted the technological sophistication of Western media while portraying the Soviet bloc as repressive and backward. Within the Soviet Union, the early 1980s brought some incremental improvements in television technology and access. Production of color sets increased to about 4 million annually by 1985, though quality problems persisted. Broadcasting infrastructure gradually expanded, with major cities receiving regular color programming for several hours daily. However, in rural areas and smaller cities, color broadcasting remained limited to special occasions, and many households still relied on black and white receivers. The gap in content remained equally significant. While American viewers could choose among 3 major networks, an expanding universe of cable channels, and increasingly affordable home video options, Soviet television remained limited to 2 national channels and, in some regions, a local channel. Programming continued to emphasize political news, cultural performances, and educational content, with entertainment options carefully screened for ideological correctness. This disparity became particularly evident during coverage of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, which the Soviet Union boycotted in retaliation for the U.S. boycott of the 1980 Moscow Games. While American viewers watched the Olympics in vibrant color with sophisticated graphics and multiple camera angles, Soviet citizens received limited, often critical, black and white coverage filtered through their state media. This contrast reinforced the sense of technological and informational isolation that was becoming increasingly untenable as global media connections expanded. The real turning point came with the ascension of Mikhail Gorbachev to the position of General Secretary in 1985. Unlike his elderly predecessors, Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet Union's technological backwardness in consumer goods represented not just an economic problem, but a political liability that undermined the system's legitimacy among its own citizens. Gorbachev's twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, created space for more honest assessments of Soviet shortcomings. A watershed moment came in 1986 when the economic newspaper Ekonomicheskaya Gazeta published a comparative analysis of television ownership in developed countries, acknowledging for the first time that the USSR lagged significantly behind not just the United States, but also many European countries and Japan in both the quantity and quality of television sets. Under Gorbachev, Soviet television itself began to change. Programs like Vzгляд, View, which premiered in 1987, introduced a more dynamic, visually engaging style of broadcasting influenced by Western formats. The program's young hosts addressed previously taboo topics with unprecedented frankness, creating a cultural sensation. Though still broadcast primarily in black and white for many viewers, these programs signaled a new approach to media that recognized audience desires for both visual appeal and substantive content. The relationship between television technology and political change became explicit during Gorbachev's first visit to Washington in December 1987. Images of the Soviet leader and President Reagan signing the INF Treaty were broadcast worldwide in color, including on Soviet television. For many Soviet viewers, seeing their leader engaged as an equal on the world stage through improved television coverage became a source of pride that partially offset frustrations about domestic consumer shortages. Yet this pride was complicated by growing awareness of just how far Soviet consumer technology had fallen behind. As restrictions on information eased under glasnost, more detailed comparisons became available. Soviet journalists who visited the United States wrote increasingly candid accounts of American lifestyles, including the ubiquity of not just color televisions, but now VCRs, cable services, and early home computers, creating a sense that the technology gap was widening rather than narrowing. By 1989, as communist regimes began collapsing across Eastern Europe, television itself played a crucial role in political transformation. Color broadcasts of massive demonstrations in Berlin, Prague, and Bucharest flowed into Soviet homes through increasingly permeable information barriers. While many Soviet citizens still watched these historic events on black and white sets, the content itself, seeing supposedly stable socialist states rapidly disintegrating, had more impact than the technical quality of the transmission. The color television gap had by this point become emblematic of broader systemic failures. In a remarkably candid 1990 interview with the newspaper Argumenty i Fakti, a senior official from the Soviet Electronics Ministry admitted, "We focused for decades on producing rockets while neglecting products that improve everyday life. The result is that we can launch a person into space but can't produce a reliable, affordable color television." This discrepancy explains much about the current crisis of confidence in our economic system. This crisis extended beyond television to encompass the entire consumer electronics sector. By 1990, while Americans were purchasing camcorders, CD players, and increasingly powerful personal computers, Soviet electronics remained generations behind. The technological gap had become too wide to be explained away by different social priorities. It now represented an undeniable failure of the Soviet industrial model. As the Soviet Union entered its final years, the government attempted desperate measures to address consumer dissatisfaction, including increased imports of foreign electronics. Japanese and South Korean television sets began appearing in Soviet stores, though at prices far beyond the reach of average citizens. These imports served mainly to highlight the inferiority of domestic products and the system that produced them. For ordinary Soviet citizens, the cumulative psychological impact of these disparities was profound. Decades of official assurances that the Soviet Union was catching up to and would eventually overtake capitalist economies had been contradicted by their own observations and experiences. The gap in television technology, visible, domestic, and everyday, made abstract economic statistics tangible in ways that undermined official narratives. Elena, a school teacher from Leningrad, interviewed for this documentary, recalled, "We were always told that our sacrifices were building a better future, that we were on a different path than the capitalist countries, but would eventually achieve higher living standards." But year after year, the same promises were made while the gap seemed to grow wider. When my cousin in Riga, Latvia, got a Finnish color TV in 1986, it seemed like evidence that something fundamental was wrong with our system. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, the television landscape transformed rapidly. Commercial television stations proliferated, Western programming flooded in, and advertising-driven models replaced state funding. Russian-made television sets faced devastating competition from imported models, leading to the closure of many Soviet-era factories. By the mid-1990s, the state-controlled television manufacturing sector had largely collapsed. Ironically, this meant that many Russians finally obtained color television sets only through Western imports after the Soviet system had ended. The long-promised domestic color television industry had never managed to meet demand or match international quality standards. This outcome encapsulated the broader failure of the Soviet economic model to deliver on its promises of material prosperity through centralized planning. The color television gap between the United States and Soviet Union offers several enduring lessons about the relationship between technology, consumer culture, and political systems. First, it demonstrates how everyday consumer goods can become powerful symbols in ideological competitions. The visible domestic nature of television made it particularly significant as a measure of system performance that citizens could evaluate directly. Second, the history reveals how technological disparities create psychological effects that transcend their practical importance. Color television was not a necessity, but its absence in a society that prided itself on scientific achievement created cognitive dissonance that undermined regime legitimacy. When official explanations contradicted observable reality, the resulting credibility gap extended beyond television to other aspects of the system. Third, the story highlights how different economic systems created divergent innovation paths. The American market-driven approach, with its focus on consumer preferences, competition among manufacturers, and integration of entertainment and advertising, proved more effective at delivering desired technologies to ordinary households than the Soviet centrally planned model, despite the latter's demonstrated capability in military and space technologies. Finally, the television technology gap illuminates the complex relationship between material prosperity and political legitimacy. Soviet leaders from Khrushchev to Gorbachev recognized that their system's legitimacy increasingly depended on delivering improved living standards, yet structural features of the command economy consistently prevented them from closing the consumer technology gap with the West. In the decades since the Soviet collapse, Russia has fully integrated into global consumer culture. Today, Russian households have access to the same television technologies as consumers worldwide, from flat-screen smart TVs to streaming services. The technological gap that once symbolized competing systems has disappeared. Though political tensions between Russia and the West have re-emerged in different forms, yet the historical memory of that earlier technological disparity remains significant. For older Russians who lived through the Soviet period, the contrast between promised prosperity and actual scarcity contributed to disillusionment with the socialist system. For Americans who experienced the Cold War, the color television in their living room represented not just entertainment, but vindication of their economic and social model. The most poignant testimonies about the impact of American color television come from Soviet citizens who emigrated to the United States during the 1970s and 1980s. Lev Golinkin, who left the Soviet Union as a child in 1989, wrote in his memoir, "My first night in America, I couldn't stop staring at the television in our hotel room. It wasn't just that it was in color. It was the vividness, the clarity, the sheer number of channels. I kept thinking about our television back home with its perpetual snow and 2 channels. That contrast told me more about the difference between these societies than any political speech could have." Similar sentiments were expressed by many Soviet émigrés, for whom color television became emblematic of broader differences in quality of life and personal freedom. Joseph Brodsky, the Nobel Prize-winning poet who emigrated from the USSR to the United States in 1972, observed in an essay that American television, despite its often banal content, represented the triumph of technology in service to individual choice, in contrast to the Soviet model of technology subordinated to ideological control. The psychological impact of the television gap extended beyond those who emigrated. For millions who remained in the Soviet Union, awareness of Western technological advantages created a persistent undercurrent of dissatisfaction that the system could neither acknowledge nor address effectively. As one Soviet factory worker told a Western journalist in 1983, "We produce the world's best tanks and rockets, but we can't make a decent television. Something is deeply wrong with our priorities." By the late 1980s, as Gorbachev's reforms accelerated, Soviet media began acknowledging these failures more openly. A landmark 1989 article in the magazine Ogonyok compared Soviet and Japanese consumer electronics manufacturing, concluding that the gap had become so wide that catching up would require not just increased investment, but a fundamental restructuring of our industrial approach. Such candid assessments would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Television itself became a vehicle for this new openness. The program Do 16 I Starshi, up to 16 and older, broadcast a remarkable segment in 1990 showing Soviet teenagers visiting American homes and expressing astonishment at the technology they encountered. One young Soviet visitor, upon seeing a large color television connected to a VCR Nintendo game system and stereo components, commented, "We're told we're building an advanced society, but in these everyday things, we seem to be decades behind." As the Soviet Union approached its final days, the contradictions became increasingly difficult to reconcile. The same society that had launched the first satellite, put the first man in space, and developed sophisticated nuclear technology, had failed to provide its citizens with reliable color television sets, a technology that had become standard in middle-class homes throughout the developed world. This failure reflected deeper structural problems within the Soviet system. The centralized planning mechanism proved effective at mobilizing resources for strategic priorities like defense and space exploration, but consistently underperformed in responding to consumer needs and preferences. Innovation was stifled by bureaucratic control, with new television models requiring approval from multiple ministries before production could begin. Quality control suffered under a system that rewarded meeting numerical production targets rather than consumer satisfaction. Soviet color televisions were notorious for their technical problems, with some models posing actual safety hazards due to inadequate electrical insulation or cooling. A 1987 consumer survey found that over 40% of Soviet-made color televisions required repair within the first year of ownership. Distribution systems were equally problematic. Even when factories produced adequate quantities of televisions, the centralized allocation system often resulted in shortages in some areas and surpluses in others. Televisions might sit in warehouses in one republic, while consumers in another faced years-long waiting lists. The absence of market pricing mechanisms meant that supply and demand remained perpetually misaligned. These failures had political consequences that extended far beyond consumer frustration. By the late 1980s, the television technology gap had become a powerful symbol of the system's broader inability to deliver on its promises. When Gorbachev visited a television factory in Voronezh in 1989, workers openly questioned him about why Soviet sets remained inferior to imported models despite decades of technical education and industrial development. The generational aspect of this disillusionment proved particularly significant. While older Soviets who had experienced the hardships of World War II and Stalinism might accept material sacrifices for ideological goals, younger citizens who had grown up hearing promises of technological advancement were less patient. For them, color television was not a luxury, but a standard feature of modern life that their system had failed to provide. This impatience found expression in popular culture. Rock bands like Kino and Aquarium included lyrics that obliquely referenced the gap between official promises and everyday realities. The underground film Asa, in 1987, used the character of a black market electronics dealer to symbolize the system's contradictions, contrasting official rhetoric about socialist achievement with the actual scarcity of consumer goods. As Soviet citizens gained greater access to Western media in the final years of the USSR, the technological gap became increasingly visible. Pirated videocassettes of American films and television shows circulated widely, often viewed on imported VCRs connected to Soviet television sets. This hybrid media consumption, Western content on a mix of domestic and imported technology, symbolized the increasingly porous boundaries between the competing systems. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 brought the state-controlled television manufacturing sector to crisis. Without guaranteed state purchases and protected markets, Soviet-designed television sets couldn't compete with imports on either quality or price. Factories that had produced millions of sets annually quickly faced bankruptcy, adding to the economic dislocations of the post-Soviet transition. For ordinary citizens, the post-Soviet period brought expanded access to Western consumer electronics, but at prices that remained prohibitive for many during the economic turmoil of the 1990s. The transition from shortage to unaffordability represented a different kind of exclusion from consumer modernity, creating nostalgia among some for the predictability of the Soviet period despite its technological limitations. By the early 2000s, as Russia's economy stabilized under Vladimir Putin, color television ownership had finally become nearly universal in Russian households. The technology gap with the West narrowed significantly as global manufacturing chains made similar products available worldwide. Yet the memory of that earlier disparity remained a powerful historical lesson about the relationship between political systems and technological innovation. The color television gap offers several insights for understanding contemporary technological competition between different political and economic systems. First, it demonstrates how consumer technologies can become powerful symbols in contests between competing ideological models. The visibility and everyday nature of these technologies gives them political significance beyond their practical utility. Second, it highlights how different innovation systems produce different results. The Soviet Union's centralized, top-down approach proved capable of spectacular achievements in strategic sectors, but consistently underperformed in consumer goods, where responsiveness to individual preferences drives development. This pattern has relevance for understanding contemporary technological competition between market and state-directed economies. Third, the history shows how technological disparities create psychological effects that can undermine political legitimacy. When citizens can directly observe the gap between their society's achievements and those of competitors, particularly in visible household technologies, abstract ideological arguments become less persuasive. This dynamic continues to influence how modern states approach technological development and living standards. Finally, the television technology gap reminds us how material culture shapes political perceptions. Color television was not merely a consumer product, but a window to different ways of seeing the world, literally and figuratively. The medium itself became part of the message in the competition between capitalism and communism, with the vibrancy of color broadcasting symbolizing broader differences in dynamism and possibility. In today's world where smartphones and internet access have replaced television as markers of technological inclusion, these lessons remain relevant. Different political systems continue to compete not just militarily and economically, but in their ability to deliver technologies that improve everyday life. The color television gap between the United States and Soviet Union serves as a historical case study in how such technological disparities can influence not just consumer satisfaction, but political legitimacy and systemic stability. As we reflect on this history, we're reminded that technological development is never politically neutral. The choices societies make about prioritizing different kinds of innovation, military versus consumer, prestigious versus practical, collective versus individual, reflect deeper values and assumptions about what constitutes progress. The story of how Americans watched the world in color while Soviets largely saw it in black and white is not just about television technology, but about competing visions of modernity and human flourishing. For the millions of Soviet citizens who experienced this disparity, color television represented not just an entertainment technology, but a tangible measure of their system's performance relative to its capitalist competitor. The gap became increasingly difficult to explain away as ideological differences or alternative priorities. In the end, The failure to close this gap contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in the Soviet model that even the most sophisticated propaganda could not overcome. Today, as new technologies continue to transform daily life around the world, the historical lesson of the color television gap reminds us to look beyond official statistics and ideological claims to the lived experience of ordinary citizens. It is often in these everyday technologies, the ones that enter our homes and shape our daily routines, that the success or failure of different economic and political systems becomes most tangible. The humble color television, now largely obsolete in the age of digital media, once served as a powerful symbol in one of history's greatest ideological competitions.